My name is Bryan Hall, and I'll be your philosopher today.
My name is Ferg, and I'm your religious historian.
Our paper evenly straddles both of these areas, which is why we decided to co-author it, and both of us are speaking to you today. Spinoza's theological political treatise, abbreviated TTP, from 1670, is widely praised for its robust defense of freedom and toleration for both Christian and non-Christian religions. Although the state has absolute power over religious practice, Spinoza argues that citizens are nonetheless free to believe and espouse what they wish. The ideal Republican state would establish only true religion, which boils down to the practices of, quote, justice and loving kindness, unquote. And this conception of true religion is intended to help resolve internecine Christian religious conflicts, while also appealing to Spinoza's target audience, members of the Dutch Reformed Church. Spinoza's view is that the practices of justice and loving kindness, that is, good works intended to, quote, strengthen our hearts and love toward our neighbors, unquote, are necessary and sufficient for Christian salvation. And just a note on citations and quotes, all of these are coming from Edwin Curley's translation of the collected works of Spinoza from 2016.
Spinoza's view is that the practices of justice and loving kindness, that is, good works, are necessary and sufficient for Christian salvation. This fails to account, however, for the centrality of orthodoxy, that is, right belief, within Christianity. The relationship between a religion and its practices will ultimately determine, for Spinoza, whether a religion ought to be tolerated. We will argue that religious beliefs must be minimally consistent with the practices of justice and loving kindness in order for the religion to be tolerated by Spinoza's ideal Republican state. The first section of our paper today examines Spinoza's conception of true religion, the role of the state in the establishment of true religion, and how this intersects with his much celebrated endorsement of religious freedom. The second section argues that Spinoza's concept of true religion, intended of course to be inclusive of Christianity, ultimately would not take sufficient account of the centrality of orthodoxy, that is, right belief within Christian history, doctrine, and notions of salvation, and would thus fail to incorporate what has been perhaps the central tenet of Christianity, proper belief. The third section of our paper will argue that although passages in the TTP suggest that religious belief must motivate justice and loving kindness to be tolerated by the ideal Republican state, Spinoza's considered view is that the expression of different religious beliefs should be tolerated as long as they are consistent with practices of justice and loving kindness. Under this interpretation, a religious community ought to be tolerated as long as its belief commitments do not preclude the practices of justice and loving kindness. This interpretation would imply, however, that religions whose core beliefs preclude the practices of justice and loving kindness should not be tolerated by Spinoza's ideal Republican state. So sort of looking at that question of what are the limits, right? The limits of toleration, which we were discussing earlier. By way of illustration, we conclude by examining two Protestant Christian movements that Spinoza might say the United States, a republic, ought not to tolerate, since they are either inconsistent with Spinoza's practices of justice and loving kindness. An example here is prosperity theology, or they actively promote the opposite of these practices, and for instance, the New Apostolic Reformation. We'll talk more about that at the end.
Spinoza is rightly celebrated as having one of the most liberal views on religious freedom in the modern period. Not only does he argue for freedom of conscience, or belief, but he also argues for freedom of speech. People ought to be able to believe what they wish religiously and to express those beliefs as well. For Spinoza, such freedoms are central to the achievement of a civil society that would allow humanity to realize its highest good, quote, the true knowledge and love of God, unquote. For Spinoza, furthermore, quote, the end of the republic is really freedom, unquote. This freedom of religious expression goes beyond what most philosophers of the time were willing to grant. For example, those familiar with Hobbes, Spinoza's major influence in this area allows for freedom of conscience, internal belief, but precludes its expression if this would lead to contention, so disagreeable disagreement is what he talks about. There are limits to toleration of religious speech, even for Spinoza, though. The state has absolute authority over religion, including the determination of what is pious. Seditious speech, speech that is destructive of the social contract, is forbidden. For example, advocating for divided sovereignty with respect to religion. For Spinoza, having an ecclesiastical power separate from the civil power, or the civil power establishing a religious sect for which it does not control, could lead to civil war. The state needs to have complete control over religion in order to minimize the possibility of sectarian violence. Ultimately, the bar for sedition is quite high for Spinoza, and religious speech that does not encourage civil unrest should be tolerated. Spinoza's views on the importance of religious freedom as well as the state control of religion generates a paradox of sorts. On the one hand, if citizens really do have the religious freedom Spinoza suggests that they should have, this undermines state control of religion. If the state really does have complete control over religion, however, this undermines the ability of citizens to hold and express religious beliefs that conflict with the state religion. Although Spinoza advocates for state sovereignty over both civil and ecclesiastical matters, he also enjoins the state to exercise extreme restraint in the establishment of religion. If the state uses too much force, this could itself lead to political violence. When citizens believe one thing, they're forced to say another, quote, the good faith especially necessary and a republic would be corrupted, unquote. This problem is exacerbated when the state tries to control not only what people do or practice and say, but also what they believe. In addition to being ostensibly impossible, something that Locke's going to later echo in just a few years, the state attempting to impose religious belief would require a level of violence that undermines the very purpose of the state, security and freedom from fear. Whereas the state has absolute control over religious practice, citizens are again free to believe and espouse what they wish. Insofar as historical religions instantiate true religion through the practices of justice and loving kindness, they should and can, for Spinoza, be tolerated by the state, even if they espouse beliefs that conflict with one another. For Spinoza, establishing true religion, so understood, serves two functions. One, it promotes security and freedom from fear. Two, it helps to ensure that citizens are pious. And Spinoza, like some of his other contemporaries, did believe that the Republic had a role to play in the moral formation of citizens, and so that's where that comes from. We will argue the problems that Spinoza considers eliminable from Christianity, the quote, disturbance and wickedness of doctrinal disputes, represents instead an essential feature of Christian history, doctrine, and piety.
Spinoza believes that his conception of true religion, and again he defines this as the law of justice and loving kindness, captures the essence of divine law throughout the Bible. Although ancient Jews in the Old Testament, according to Spinoza's logic, were required only to practice justice and loving kindness within their own community, something that was obviously ironically compatible with the slaughter of other nations, Christ in the New Testament made this prescription universal. Christ translated Mosaic law into a moral message that applies to all humanity. Spinoza's conception of universal faith summarizes what he believes is essential to piety. Following Mogen's Lerka, Spinoza's universal faith provides the speculative foundation for his true religion, while true religion provides the practical standard for his universal faith. What is essential to this faith is that it motivates the right kind of action, namely the practices, and only those practices, of justice and loving kindness. For Spinoza, quote, the faith of each person should be considered pious or impious only on account of his obedience or stubbornness, not on account of its truth or falsity, end quote. The requisite obedience would be toward works that encourage us, this is a quote here, to, again, quote, strengthen our hearts in love toward our neighbors, end quote. Spinoza did think that his conception of universal faith was basic enough to capture other world religions, in particular, other Abrahamic religions. He specifically speaks about Judaism and Islam. The second quote on this slide is often taken as evidence of Spinoza's religious pluralism, but it's important to note that this pluralism requires that the religion in question be grounded in what Spinoza takes to be the essence of Christianity. Ironically, given the audience that Spinoza hoped to attract to the TTP, such a definition of universal faith would not readily be recognizable by most forms of Christianity contemporaneous to Spinoza, and especially not to mainstream Protestant understanding of salvation or justification before God. Spinoza's goal in the first place of proposing the notion of universal faith was to offer a solution to the entrenched religious conflicts and intolerance of his own day. He intended for the notion of universal faith to eliminate doctrinal, quote, controversies in the church, end quote, and to do so using the simplest, most fundamental terms possible. Protestant notions of salvation, both in Spinoza's time and in our own, were based on the New Testament letters of Paul, as well as the Gospels, in particular Mark and John, and emphasized that the possession of proper belief about the salvific death and resurrection of Jesus are required to help save a person from sin and death. Spinoza argues from a very different perspective that justification or saving required the practicing of justice and loving kindness towards one's neighbor. Spinoza is not unaware of what he's arguing, and he is at pains throughout the TTP to highlight the actions of Jesus in the Gospels, especially in the Gospel of Matthew, and to tie his understanding of salvation and justification to proper Christian action, rather than to proper belief. Spinoza grounds his arguments in the New Testament letters of James and 1 John in claiming that works, or actions, are what enable a person to be saved. This sets Spinoza at odds not only with centuries of Western and Eastern Christian doctrine about the essentiality of proper belief, but it places him in direct opposition to established Protestant doctrine about the principal role of faith in salvation. This is unusual, to say the least, and potentially unrecognizable in Christianity for some of his audiences at best. The very religion of Christianity itself can be characterized around the matter of belief. This took place both early on, in terms of beliefs about the resurrection of Jesus and the salvation provided thereby, as well as during the coming centuries when detailed creedal statements and the Christian notion of the Trinity, a three-person Godhead, Father, Son, and Jesus Christ, and Holy Spirit, who comprises one God rather than three, were articulated over time. Christianity, at every point during its existence, has consisted of beliefs, specific mental propositions like creeds, doctrines, or particular theological framework to which one assents. This is an issue that Spinoza acknowledges, but he argues that the salvific power of works is more consistent with Christ's moral message in Scripture overall than is the notion of sola fide salvation. He even goes so far as to claim that loving justice, this is a quote, loving justice and loving kindness are enough to make a man faithful. This is stronger than saying that faith is necessary but insufficient for piety, that is, that good works are a necessary and jointly sufficient condition with faith. Rather, the idea seems to be that the practices of justice and loving kindness, which involve good works, are necessary and sufficient for piety. This conception of true religion, however, ignores what is both essential to and distinctive of Christianity. Specifically, the view overlooks the relationship between orthodoxy and piety, whereas Spinoza believes that doctrinal disputes over orthodoxy and right belief should be eliminated from Christianity. We have argued that they constitute instead the essence of Christian doctrine and are inextricably linked to Christian piety. Adopting Spinoza's view on Christianity does not take sufficient account of the indispensability of Christian doctrine for the notions of salvation. The exclusive nature of Christianity, the fact that since the time of the Nicene Creed, Christian salvation has required the acceptance of certain theological propositions, is something that Spinoza passes over in silence.
When discussing the state establishment of religion and religious toleration, Spinoza seems to make a distinction between practice and belief. Whereas the ideal republic should establish a religion that includes only the practices of justice and loving kindness, people should feel free to believe and say what they wish from the religious standpoint. This still leaves open the question, however, of what the relationship must be, if any, between these religious beliefs and the practices of justice and loving kindness. Must religious belief motivate or only be consistent with the practices of justice and loving kindness to be tolerated by the ideal Republican state? What kind of connection, if any, must there be between religious belief and the practice of justice and loving kindness for the state to tolerate the belief? There are points where Spinoza suggests that the connection must be motivational. That is, religious beliefs must motivate justice and loving kindness if they are to be tolerated. For example, Spinoza claims that, quote, faith requires piety more than it does truth, and suggests that limiting the toleration of religious belief to those beliefs that are motivational of true religion is necessary, quote, necessary in the Republic if people are to live peacefully and harmoniously, unquote. The problem here is that certain sects of Christianity do not claim a connection, motivational or otherwise, between the doctrinal beliefs required for salvation and pietistic practices of justice and loving kindness. A greatest concern from Spinoza's perspective would be the Dutch Reformed Church, which subscribes to the doctrine of sola fide, salvation through faith alone, and emphasizes that salvation is attained through faith in Jesus Christ, not through human works or merit. Put pointedly, within the Dutch Reformed Church, right belief, for example, having belief in the tenets of the Nicene Creed, irrespective of action, is both necessary and sufficient for salvation. If religious beliefs must motivate good works for the beliefs to be tolerated, sola fide would not meet this condition for toleration. It ought to be noted, however, that even if good works are not required for salvation according to the Dutch Reformed Church, they could still be said to be the natural outgrowth of the Christian life. Moreover, it certainly would be ironic and contrary to Spinoza's intent if the religious audience he had hoped to attract to the TTP would not be tolerated under the strictures of TTP. A more charitable interpretation, one consistent with the quote on the previous slide, as well as Spinoza's high bar for sedition, would hold that the expression of different religious beliefs should be tolerated as long as they are consistent with the practices of justice and loving kindness. Under this interpretation, the Dutch Reformed Church should be tolerated as long as its endorsement of sola fide salvation does not preclude the practices of justice and loving kindness. Put even more generally, differing Christian sects should be allowed to evangelize, believe, and other religious traditions should be allowed their quote-unquote ceremonies, as Spinoza puts it, their practices, as long as doing so does not violate the state's own prescriptions for justice and loving kindness.
The purpose of the ideal Republican state is freedom, according to Spinoza. The practices of justice and loving kindness promote the peace and harmony that constitute the background conditions for freedom, especially religious freedom. If what a religion espouses conflicts with the practices of justice and loving kindness, then it should not be tolerated by Spinoza's ideal Republican state. There are many examples throughout history of ostensibly Christian groups who would fail to meet this condition for toleration. We conclude here with two contemporary examples of Protestant movements that Spinoza would say should not be tolerated by the United States, a Republican state. The first is prosperity theology, which is minimally inconsistent with the practices of justice and loving kindness. The second is the New Apostolic Reformation, which actively promotes the opposite of these practices. Prosperity theology, which is also known, you may have heard of this before, as the prosperity gospel, the health and wealth gospel, or the gospel of success, refers to a theological perspective that focuses on the notion that financial and physical well-being are the intent of true Christianity. Prosperity theology teaches that the way to gain riches is to give more money to the kingdom, by which is usually meant donations to one's own churches and ministries, or a particular person asking for those donations. The quantity of material and financial prosperity one can be expected to gain is in equal proportion to what one gives, and it's believed that in this life, if someone exercises enough faith, he will no longer have to be subject to the crippling effects of sickness and disease. However, if individuals continue to suffer afflictions or poverty, those conditions are due to that person's lack of faith. Holding aside issues of orthodoxy or right belief or normative claims about Christianity, one could certainly agree that the core beliefs in the prosperity theology doctrine that enrich only a few, usually not the poor, and that sickness, poverty, and disease are evidence of God's displeasure and a person's lack of faith would seem at the very least to be inconsistent with Spinoza's practices of justice and loving kindness, and perhaps even to preclude them. The New Apostolic Reformation is a Christian theocratic movement that emerged in America in the mid-1990s with roots in the 1950s Pentecostal Christianity in the States. The aim of the New Apostolic Reformation is to destroy secular government and society in order to achieve Christian, quote, dominion over the, quote, 7 mountains of life. These are government, education, business, media, family, arts, and religion. This is known within this particular perspective, again, New American Protestant Christianity, as dominionism. Its goal, politically and governmentally, is to implement a government grounded in, quote, biblical laws, that is, a Christian theocratic government. The New Apostolic Reformation teaches that economic and societal problems exist because of the demons of secular society and its agents, and that God will remedy all social ills once Christian dominion over the 7 mountains of society is complete. The New Apostolic Reformation is a surprisingly robust religious movement in the United States. Russell Vought is the current director of the United States Office of Management and Budget, and the named successor for the so-called Department of Government Efficiency. Vought is the primary author of Project 2025, a policy project currently being enacted in the United States that largely involves the dismantling of federal government institutions. Vought is a self-described Christian nationalist whose involvement in projects like 2025 that align with New Apostolic Reformation goals, as well as his association with prominent New Apostolic Reformation figures, offer an example of the reach of this movement within American government. The New Apostolic movement excludes all non-Christian members of society, atheists, Muslims, Buddhists, homosexuals, Democrats, journalists, many different categories, all of those who do not share the New Apostolic Reformation vision for society and government. Both its goals of the complete destruction of secular government and society, and its exclusion of and desire to reform all Christians and non-members, Christians who just are not members of that movement, would suggest that the New Apostolic Reformation is a movement that actively precludes Spinoza's practices of justice and loving kindness, and ought not to be tolerated in Spinoza's ideal Republican state. Such a conclusion is relevant not only if one accepts Spinoza's view on the freedom that constitutes the goal of the Republican state and the conditions for achieving that goal, but also because Spinoza's concerns about and views on religious freedom remain relevant to our own day. Thank you.